There is no doubt that China is one of the most powerful countries in the world today. To some, China's rise to power has been nerve-wracking. Yet China has always been powerful and influential. And in the grand scheme of human history, China being an economic and cultural powerhouse has actually been the norm. So let's take a look at the evolution of China and why it may be on track to be the world's next #1 superpower. If you want to understand why things are the way they are today, you have to understand the past. The Chinese culture is one of the oldest in the world. And like today, the ancient Chinese were builders. Construction projects on a massive scale are being built right now, putting millions of Chinese citizens to work. And over 2,000 years ago, China was doing the same thing, although there was definitely more slave labor being used in the past. One of the most famous construction projects of ancient times started at the beginning of Chinese history. Qin Shi Huangdi had unified much of the Chinese heartland between 221 and 206 BC, and it was during that time that construction began on the first Great Wall of China. The period following Qin Shi Huangdi's rule was considered the first golden age of the region. Between 206 BC and 220 AD, China saw huge leaps in economic growth and its cultural spread. Approximately 400 years later, a relatively short time in the scheme of things, the second golden age of China began, and it extended its sphere of influence all the way into Central Asia. Just like with all empires, change in power was something to be expected. By the 13th century, the Mongols had conquered China and united much of the country under their rule. During this time, Beijing became the capital, and Westerners such as Marco Polo visited the country. This marked the starting point of contact between China and the West, which eventually evolved into prosperous trading relationships and the exchange of ideas, but also led to death and destruction when the Mongols swept across the Asian continent and invaded Europe. In 1368, the Ming dynasty overthrew the Mongols and took control of the country, and China moved away from warfare and conquest to start focusing on the country itself. China's economy ramped up due to high agricultural output. The bureaucracy and military were centralized, and the Great Wall of China was completed. We often forget that when learning about other countries, we're taught about them through the lens of our own culture. For people living in the Western world, the history curriculum in school rarely touches on the achievements or cultures of Asian countries. Make no mistake, just because China's early power and influence aren't often taught or talked about, that doesn't mean they didn't happen. China's past was full of advancements and economic growth, something that continues to this day. We know of Chinese influences in the ancient past from written records and archaeological data. As we move closer to the present, we have even more information about the chain of events which led to China becoming one of the most powerful nations on the planet. By the 19th century, Western powers had colonized many parts of the world, including Asia. China had been in a long decline, and the unequal treaties negotiated by European powers had crippled the Chinese economy even further. This led to the destabilization of the government, allowing regional warlords to rise to power. During the 19th and early 20th century, events were set in motion that would lead to modern-day China. It was a time of bloodshed and oppression in the country. Foreign intervention in the affairs of China led to the exploitation of its government and peoples, which led to massive amounts of poverty. Along with Russia and Japan, Western countries exploited China and forced the government into giving concessions while simultaneously weakening the country's ruling body. Then in 1931, Japan invaded China. Over the next decade, they occupied more and more Chinese land. In 1937, the different factions within China united to fight back against the Japanese annexation of their country. Finally, the Chinese took back their lands but immediately fell into civil war, and whoever won would rule the country. China had gone through decades of struggle to regain its land and power. In 1949, Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Party of China, was victorious over the opposing nationalist side during the Civil War. The foundation of modern-day China had finally begun. It's essential not to forget everything that led up to this point. The idea of China's power and influence in the past are still ingrained in the country's cultural history. The memories of oppression and exploitation by the Western nations and their allies were also still fresh in the collective consciousness of the Chinese people. And the longing to return to a time where China's power and economic strength were respected was a driving force for the decisions made by the new communist government. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, a 5-year economic plan that was meant to lift the Chinese people out of poverty and jumpstart the country's economy. It was supposed to collectivize farming and introduce labor-intensive industries. As with all economic plans, not everyone would benefit, and the plan ended up being a complete failure. However, the move toward revitalizing the Chinese economy persisted. Mao's follow-up plan was the Cultural Revolution, which lasted 10 years and changed the country's political and ideological systems. It was a way to inspire a revolutionary spirit in the people, which it did, but not in the way Mao had intended. The masses protested, causing disruptions in the economic, social, and political systems of China. This primed the country for extreme changes. When Mao died in 1976, he was succeeded by Deng Xiaoping. His main goal was to start China on a path to economic reform that would make the country wealthy and influential in the growing world economy. Xiaoping knew that to ramp up the economy, the country needed a healthy workforce. Population growth in China had exploded, which meant there were plenty of workers, but the resources required to support so many people were lacking. In response to this, the government imposed a one-child policy to try and curb population growth. The government also granted peasants the right to farm their own plots of land instead of relying solely on the communist distribution system. These changes resulted in improved living standards and decreased the number of food shortages. Xiaoping also started China's open door policy, which now allowed diplomatic relations to resume and foreign investments to begin within the country. It also provided other nations access to China's very large yet very cheap labor workforce. All of these things combined led to enormous amounts of money being poured into China, setting the country up to become one of the largest economies in the world. China was gaining massive amounts of wealth and influence through relations with different governments and corporations around the world. The open door policy also allowed the development of a market economy and private business sectors. But just like when wealth and growth come to any country, the average citizen does not always benefit. Corruption in the government ran rampant, and influential leaders were getting wealthy from the economic boom. But poverty and cultural shifts led to protests around China. This culminated in the Tiananmen Square massacre. International outrage led to sanctions on China, but this did not stop the economic engine that had already been set in motion. In 1989, stock markets opened in Shanghai and Shenzhen, leading to even more economic growth. 3 years later, Russia and China signed a declaration restoring cooperation between the two countries, which allowed for further economic opportunities for China. In that same year, the International Monetary Fund ranked China as the third largest economy in the world after the United States and Japan. It wouldn't be long until they moved up even further in the rankings. On October 1, 1999, the country celebrated its 50th anniversary as the People's Republic of China. The following year, the government cracked down on corruption with public executions. Not everyone agreed with the methods of the People's Republic, but the power that they wielded allowed for swift change and few actual repercussions. In 2001, China met with Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan to create the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The mission of this new alliance was to combat ethnic and religious militancy in the countries. Of even more significant benefit to China, though, was the agreement which promoted trade and investment between the countries. With economic opportunity looming around every corner, China took the next step in expanding its power and influence by joining the World Trade Organization. This allowed for negotiations with other countries to lower trade barriers and tariffs on Chinese goods. With fewer restrictions and the ability to trade worldwide more efficiently, the Chinese economy grew faster than ever. Many people still lived in poverty, though, and the government continuously turned a blind eye to unlawful working conditions. Some workers were even treated as slaves or paid an unlivable wage. This allowed Chinese companies to make and sell products at lower and lower prices while still making enormous profits. As the economy grew, more resources could be spent on other government projects like military and space programs. In 2003, China launched its first crewed spacecraft. 2 years after that, China and Russia conducted their first joint military exercises. With a powerful ally in Russia and several free trade agreements with other countries in the region, China gained more and more power. While expanding its global influence, China had also been constructing cities and internal renovation projects that created jobs and cash flow for its citizens. In 2006, China finished building the world's largest hydroelectric dam, called the Three Gorges Dam. Later that year, China met with African leaders for the China-African Summit in Beijing. Around $2 billion in business deals were agreed upon in exchange for loans and credit from China. This only furthered China's economic power and gave them leverage in the future. With the industrialization of China, its numerous large-scale construction projects, and the desire to keep its economy growing, concerns about public and environmental health had fallen to the wayside. The government acknowledged that pollution in the country had reached critical levels and that new policies would be implemented to deal with the problem. However, this did not stop the economic drive of the country. The government continued to pour money into technology and the military. China tested long-range missiles and even shot down an old weather satellite in space, showing the world that they now had missiles capable of hitting targets in orbit. In 2008, as the global economy slowed down, the Chinese government announced a $586 billion stimulus package to ensure their economic growth wouldn't stall. To secure the resources they need, China signed a $25 billion deal with Russia, making sure that the country has enough oil for the next 20 years. In 2010, China became the world's largest exporter, and the following year, China overtook Japan as the world's second largest economy. And even after China overtook Japan, it continued to grow its economy until 2014, at which point things finally started to slow down. China's economy is still growing, but not at the incredible rate that it had been over the previous decade. Thanks to a strong economy and a government with absolute authority, China grew into one of the most powerful nations in the world. But this is not surprising, as even in the past, China was incredibly influential. They had the workforce to ramp up their economy, and once they switched from isolationist policies to joining the global economy, there was very little that could stop China's progress. The economic gains made by China did pull hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but at the expense of polluted air and unsafe working conditions. Whether your political ideology is for or against the way China runs its country, there's no denying that there were benefits from the reforms and economic policies they implemented. Education rates have gone up drastically, and it's estimated that by 2030 the same percentage of Chinese workers will have a university degree as countries in Europe have today. However, many poor rural communities in the country have low skill levels and an aging workforce, but this is also true in other economically advanced countries around the world. China became powerful by taking a different path than Western countries, and now with a thriving economy comes the ability to have a strong military and loan out money to other countries, which can be used as leverage in the future. It's no surprise that after a time of relatively low economic and cultural output during the European colonization, China would eventually return to its norm as being one of the most powerful countries in the world, a position it's held for much of its multi-thousand-year history. Now check out the real reason why China wants to expand. Or watch China versus United States. Who would win? 2020 Military Army Comparison.